Disney. This name has long become a household term. I'm sure among the audience watching Disney Studios films and series, there are those who are not even aware that it's a surname. Meanwhile, in the middle of the last century, Walt Disney was perhaps the most famous person on the planet, excluding politicians. But why and what was he really like? Some would say Disney was cruel, hypocritical and mercenary. He steamrolled over those who disagreed with him, and he was accused of sexism, anti-Semitism, and of course mediocrity. All he could do was profit from others' ideas. Others would say it was Walt who created stories that touched billions of people. He turned animation into an art form and achieved gigantic success in various fields. And you know what? All of this is true. What else can be expected from one of the most influential people of the last century? So, if you always thought old Disney was just a good-natured grandpa who created a few cartoon characters from childhood, then you were deeply mistaken. Well, let's find out what the real Walt Disney was like. Okay, let's start with a small test. We'll take some of the most famous characters from Disney animation: Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, Cinderella, Bambi, and Snow White. Who do you think was drawn by Walt Disney? None of them. To tell you more, Walt Disney wasn't great at drawing. He isn't even the author of his own signature, which today is the logo of the Disney Corporation. And this person is considered a genius of animation, but this is the very type of art where characters are drawn. I have only one question. How? Well, the answer won't be short. Just look at the video's timeline. So let's begin. The year 1919. At this time, Walt Disney returned to America from the war. At this moment, he was almost 18 by official documents and no more than 16 by appearance. During the First World War, he voluntarily served as a driver for the Red Cross in France. The birth certificate had to be forged since Walt was not of the proper age to serve. For a teenager who grew up in rural America, the war in Europe seemed like an adventure, and Disney adored adventures. In 1919, Walt's father, Elias, was involved in housing production in Chicago. After returning from the war, going to work at his father's factory seemed the most logical decision for young Walt. He came from a working-class family that had financial issues all its life. Disney's father engaged in various businesses with differing degrees of unsuccessfulness. The misfortune of his father is possibly one explanation for why Walt chose a completely different path in life. However, most likely, the main reason is creativity. Disney loved being the center of attention. Disney wanted to do what he liked. Disney wanted success. Walt takes the money he earned during his service in Europe and moves away from his parents to Kansas City, the city where he spent most of his childhood, to start a creative career. It's still unclear what exactly that was to be. There were two options: to become an actor or an artist. The latter seemed more logical. For reference, Kansas City is located in the very center of the United States. And although it is the largest city in the state, it is essentially a province. Not at all like New York or Los Angeles, the two largest cinema business centers at that time. Finding an acting job in Kansas City is much more difficult than finding a job as an artist. Businesses need to sell. Advertising is the engine of commerce, and someone needs to draw the advertisements. Walt learns about the vacancy thanks to his older brother's connections. He takes his amateur drawings and goes to show them to a potential employer. After a short trial period, Disney receives his first position. He draws advertising brochures and catalogs. Disney is so engrossed in his new occupation and the process of learning that he doesn't leave his desk all day, skipping breaks and lunch. At that time, Walt thinks his life is successful, and he is doing what he dreamed of. Less than a year later, the company faces financial problems and some employees are dismissed, among them Walt Disney and UB Iwerks. They are united by the fact that both started building their careers as artists without finishing school. Otherwise, it is difficult to imagine two people more different in character than Disney and Iwerks. Walt is a vigorous extrovert, attempting to achieve fame through his drawings. UB Iwerks is a reserved introvert for whom drawing is a way of communicating with the outside world. One of them will draw a character in the future that the whole world will know, and that person will not be Walt Disney. Disney and Iwerks quickly find new work at a company producing commercials, but the main thing is that these commercials are made in animation technique. Here, an important point needs to be clarified. By the early 1920s, the entire history of animation is just a couple of decades. No one considers animation an art form. There is neither color nor sound. It is just a fascinating technology. You photograph each phase of movement of drawn characters separately, combine all the frames into one film reel, run the reel through a projector, and the characters come to life and move. At that time, it seemed like a technology of the future. This combination of technology and art attracted Disney, a combination that would serve as Walt's primary inspiration for several more decades. Disney begins to fervently study the new technology. Walt learns all aspects of animation, starting with drawing and ending with the technical features of connecting frames into a whole. Then Disney discovers an interesting detail. There are two ways to make a drawn character move. The first is when animators move a cut-out character frame by frame. Essentially, this is stop-motion animation. The main downside is that the movements do not look very natural and realistic. This was the method used at Walt's new workplace. The second method, which Disney learned about, is cell animation. Each phase of a character's movement is drawn separately, 1 to 2 dozen frames in 1 second of action. This approach achieves a completely different level of realism. This discovery changes almost everything. By that time, Walt Disney's father's latest business venture in Chicago had failed and they returned to Kansas City. Walt occupied the garage at his parents' home, borrowed a camera from work, and began experimenting. His parents were not particularly supportive of their son's endeavors. Walt's father wasn't thrilled when Walt decided to become an illustrator, but then he at least understood it as a legitimate profession. Now, Walt was involved in something that didn't resemble work at all. Disney's father, Elias, was a complex man. The son of Irish immigrants with 5 children, Walt was the fourth among them. Elias dabbled in farming, construction, newspaper delivery, and several other businesses. Misfortune seemed to pursue him constantly, leading to a modest lifestyle for the family, and Walt began working as a child. By and large, the boy did not have a carefree childhood. Walt Disney discovered animation just as he reached adulthood. Now he was determined that the time had come to move towards success. Disney released several short films, each a couple of minutes long. He sold them to the owner of a theater in Kansas City. The deal did not even cover the production costs, but this hardly concerned the aspiring animator. His shorts, Laugh-O-Gram, became mega-popular in Kansas. This so exhilarated Walt that he opened his own studio, named it Laugh-O-Gram Studio, hired several people, and began producing animation. Disney signed a contract for several shorts. Not only was their production so costly that the venture seemed unlikely to repay itself, but the client soon went bankrupt. Walt needed to pay salaries and rent. Yet instead of cutting costs and doing something likely to be purchased, Disney raised the stakes. At this time, a company from New York was conducting an intriguing experiment. They were combining cinema and animation. Although Walt had heard that such an approach was expensive, complex, and by no means guaranteed success, he immersed himself in the work entirely. For the concept, Disney took Alice in Wonderland. The idea was that a live-action girl found herself in an animated world, interacting with drawn characters and events. Disney and his colleagues learned everything on the go. They wrote, filmed, drew, and edited. Sometimes there was no time to eat or sleep. Walt needed to produce a complete episode of Alice to show it to major New York companies in hopes of securing a commission. Despite hard times and an uncertain future, later Disney would recall that this period was one of happiness and inspiration. He was engaged in creativity. Reality did not share Disney's sentiment. A buyer for Alice didn't manifest, his company would be declared bankrupt, and Walt abandoned everything and journeyed across the country to Los Angeles. Hollywood in the 1920s was not yet world-renowned, but significant events for the arts were already occurring there. And although it is clear at that moment that Walt Disney was made for Hollywood, it is by no means obvious that Hollywood was made for him. After the failure of his animation studio, Disney arrives in Los Angeles, emaciated and in worn-out clothing. Walt decides to adjust his dreams and this time become a director. He visits studios, watches the filming process, and tries to secure any work, but all in vain. Slightly earlier, Walt's elder brother Roy had arrived in Los Angeles. He was not drawn to Hollywood, but rather to the gentle Californian climate. Roy had lung problems. Walt's brother was always characterized by rationality and prudence. In the future, this would become one of the secrets of Disney Studios' success. But in the early 20s, Roy is merely selling vacuum cleaners. He also advises his younger brother to find a regular job, one that pays. Walt Disney, of course, was a multifaceted individual, but it's simply impossible to imagine him selling vacuum cleaners or doing any other such job. His entire biography attests to this. At the moment when Walt is unsuccessfully trying to become a Hollywood director, a woman named Margaret Winkler contacts him. While still in Kansas, Disney desperately tried to find a distributor for Alice in Wonderland and sent letters to all potential buyers, including Margaret Winkler. He receives her response after moving to Los Angeles. Margaret Winkler was that very distributor, and she liked Disney's initial idea for Alice in Wonderland. She is ready to order 12 episodes and pays $1,500 for each. These were significant sums at the time. In the early 20s, a car in the United States cost approximately $500, and for his work in Kansas, Disney earned $50. Calling Winkler's offer a success would be a severe understatement. Walt immediately shares the news with his brother and suggests they work together. Walt needs someone like Roy, rational and prudent. Of course, the elder brother would never have invented what Walt eventually would, but on the other hand, without him, Disney Studios might not have existed at all. Most likely, it would have faced the same fate as the failed Laugh-O-Gram studio in Kansas. It was Roy who would handle all business and organizational matters. In this regard, the Disney brothers would form an ideal team. However, back in 1923, Roy Disney wasn't quite aware that he was now working in the film business alongside Walt. Roy only agreed to help his younger brother a little in an endeavor that still seemed extremely unclear. On one hand, Walt had a contract. On the other hand, he would receive payment for it only after he produced the necessary Alice episodes. Roy helped gather most of the budget for filming. Considering the gigantic scale that Disney Studio represents today, and represented in the middle of the last century, it is hard to even believe how it all began. Walt produced the first 6 episodes of Alice independently. He animated them and also filmed live-action episodes with an actress. For a location, they used nearby Griffith Park. However, to film there, permission was needed. Of course, Disney didn't have it. Therefore, they would go and work until a policeman chased them away. After that, they entered the park from another entrance and continued filming until they were chased away again. Everything was filmed in a single take, simply because the novice filmmaker practically had no film. Nevertheless, Disney finished the first episodes and received payment for them. However, distributor Winkler was not particularly impressed with the quality. In his opinion, the product could and should be improved. Disney understood this as well. There was one way to achieve quality improvement: hire people who were good at animation, people who did it better than Walt himself. Even back then, at the very beginning, he understood his limits well. Yes, Disney liked drawing, but as an artist, animator and director, he wasn't very strong. Walt hired several people onto the team, among them his colleague from Kansas, Ub Iwerks. The studio released a new series of Alice every 6 weeks. The business gradually began to bring good profits. Walt and Roy hired new people. The staff expanded so much that they no longer had enough space in one office, and a whole building was necessary. In 1926, the studio moved, and the sign prominently displayed Walt Disney Studio. Until that moment, the studio had been somewhat a joint business of the two brothers. It was in 1926 that Walt decided the company would now bear his name. On one hand, this vividly demonstrated the creator's ego. On the other hand, his brother didn't mind, and hardly anyone could deny that the main idea producer, leader and inspirer of the whole process was Walt. So I've already talked a lot about what animation was like in the 1920s from a technical point of view. But that only answers the question of how. It is equally important to answer the question of what. What was the content like? It was no less primitive than the technologies. The main star of American animation in the mid-1920s was Felix the Cat. His short films, just a few minutes long, were entirely based on jokes. To be more precise, they relied on simple visual jokes that were understood without words and dialogues. After all, there was no sound in movies, yet just amusing, and most importantly, understandable to both children and adults. All our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them. This is one of Walt Disney's most famous quotes. Let's be honest, the thought itself sounds like yet another meaningless motivational quote from the internet. And only if you know the biography of the hero of this story does the phrase gain a very important message. What always distinguished Disney was the ability to believe in his idea and not give up, even at times when it seemed like it was all over. And there were quite a few such episodes, especially at the very beginning, when 20-year-old Walt was just creating his company. Disney closely watched Felix's successes and decided that the studio needed its own hit character. Cats were not considered at all, as there were already many in the animation market. Besides, Disney was confident that their character should differ from Felix and others in that he would evoke not only smiles and laughter but also sympathy. Thus the character Oswald the Lucky Rabbit appeared. This time, no live-action scenes, only pure animation. Ub Iwerks was responsible for the visual part and Walt Disney for the plot. The first short film impressed the bosses of Universal Studios so much that they immediately ordered 26 episodes. On the one hand, it's a super success for Disney's company. On the other, a serious challenge. Despite the expanded staff, Walt and all the studio employees worked equally hard, including late evenings and weekends. None of the workers, even in the lowest positions, addressed the leader as Mr. Disney or boss. They simply called him Walt. However, with the rapid development of the studio, this ideal picture began to crack. Everyone worked a lot, but most of the dividends and fame went to Walt. Moreover, the boss certainly knew how to inspire and motivate, but sometimes he was not just demanding but despotic. Serious discontent began to brew in the studio. Charles Mintz, the husband of that very Margaret Winkler, decided to take advantage of this. He was also one of the heads of their distribution company. The point is, the contract for producing new episodes of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit with Universal was concluded precisely through Mintz. He decided to exploit the discontent of the employees, lure them away, and begin producing Oswald the Lucky Rabbit directly without Walt's involvement. Disney traveled to New York, where Mintz's company was located, and tried to negotiate, but unsuccessfully. He lost control over the characters, most of the animators left him, and it was entirely unclear how the studio would earn money now. At that moment he felt that he was repeating the fate of his father, who had been plagued by misfortunes all his life. Returning to Los Angeles from New York, Walt Disney passed through Marceline, a small place not far from Kansas City. In Marceline, Disney spent several years in his early childhood when his father attempted farming there. Walt always loved this place. Pure nature, animals and freedom, a complete contrast to the big cities. For Disney, Marceline would forever remain the perfect place, a place where a short period of his true carefree childhood passed. Upon returning to Los Angeles, Disney realized he needed a new hit character, one that would outshine both Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, Felix the Cat, and other competitors. He sat down with chief animator Ub Iwerks and started brainstorming. They considered different styles, different shapes, and different animals. Finally, they settled on a mouse. The character was designed with rounded, stylized features. With little effort, long ears could be added to transform it into a rabbit. Shorten them, and it becomes a cat. Walt named the mouse Mortimer. Luckily, by that time, Disney was already married. Lillian had come to work at the studio a few years earlier. She was involved in character inking. It was Lillian who said that Mortimer was a terrible name for the new character and suggested Mickey. Walt, listening to his wife, agreed. Perhaps the main secret of Mickey Mouse's success was his personality. Disney conceived that the hero had to be charming, unpretentious, and capable of coming out of any challenging situation with a smile and head held high. To some extent, Mickey Mouse was the embodiment of Disney's own character. The studio released several shorts featuring the new hero and tried to sell them, but no one bought them. Disney realized that he needed a feature that would immediately make the new character stand out from all other competitors. The solution turned out to be sound. In 1927, the film The Jazz Singer was released, the first full-fledged sound film in the sense that sounds and words were entirely synchronized with the action on screen. It created the full impression that real people were talking on screen. Walt couldn't pass on such technology. Disney spared no expense and effort on the latest invention. He would work by this principle all his life, no matter what happened to the company's finances. At that time, no one used fully synchronized sound in animation. There were many reasons for this. Firstly, it was very expensive. Secondly, it was very complex and, most importantly, unclear why it was necessary. There was no guarantee that the audience even needed it. After all, from animation, everyone mostly expected jokes that were understandable even without sound. But none of these arguments bothered Disney. He sensed it was a breakthrough. Disney went to New York to purchase equipment for recording sound. Funds were insufficient. He wrote to his brother, urgently requesting him to find money and, if necessary, sell Walt's car. With difficulty, they recorded sound for one Mickey Mouse short, but then a new problem arose. There was no distributor. No one wanted to buy the new cartoon, so Disney himself negotiated with the owner of a Broadway theatre in New York to run Mickey Mouse for 2 weeks. In November of the year 1928, audiences for the first time witness a 7-minute film featuring Mickey Mouse titled Steamboat Willie. These 7 minutes will change the history of global animation, the history of world cinema, and of course the life of Walt Disney. The public is thrilled, primarily due to the use of sound. Steamboat Willie does not differ significantly visually from other competitors, but the visuals combined with synchronized sounds are something no one had seen before. It reaches the point where audiences sometimes demand to postpone the start of the movie scheduled to follow the short, to replay Mickey Mouse. The animated mouse immediately becomes a Hollywood star. People all over the country flock to theaters to see the new character. Ticket sales are not hindered even by the onset of the Great Depression in the United States. However, Walt Disney was not so astute as to deeply understand the mood of society. He merely intuitively discovered a formula that would lead him to success more than once. An interesting story, plus an appealing character, plus new technology. Very quickly, Mickey Mouse clubs start organizing all over America. Children adore the mouse. Roy Disney realizes that they need merchandise. They hire the best specialists in the country at that time who understand licensing, rights sales, and other mundane but very profitable matters. Books, ties, watches, posters, watering cans, masks, ice cream. The list could go on endlessly. On these items are images of Mickey Mouse and his girlfriend Minnie. The studios rapidly come up with new characters, among whom are Donald Duck and Goofy. New cartoons, new merchandise, and profits start pouring into the studio like a river. But it is not only the public that is delighted with Walt's animation and the company. Many serious directors from all over the world recognize this as an achievement in visual art. Walt increases the staff again, but despite this, both Disney and his employees often work late into the night to meet deadlines. In the year 1931, Walt's wife Lillian is pregnant. Walt often told her he wanted a large family with many children. Lillian had serious doubts, considering her husband's workload at the studio. Walt is in great anticipation of their future child. He is even looking for a new home. But in the spring of the same year, Lillian suffers a miscarriage. Although Disney tries to appear as if everything is normal and continues to work intensely, over time it becomes clear that this is a significant blow for him. In the same year, 30-year-old Walt and his wife take their first vacation in his life. He finds a hobby, it becomes polo, and Disney finally realizes that life is not just work. Does he start working less because of this? No. The studio makes a new leap forward and releases Silly Symphonies, short films featuring various characters, including inanimate objects that, for the first time on screen, acquire personality and character. The project receives special recognition in the professional community. Animators from all over the country want to work at the studio. Animation gains sound, color, but most importantly, becomes an art and a respected profession, not just silly drawings. Walt begins to educate his employees. He understands that animation operates under the laws of visual art, and the artists in his studio must also be versed in classical fundamentals. Therefore, he invites professors from reputable universities to the studio who give lectures and conduct practical drawing lessons. It is worth noting that in the 1930s, out of several hundred studio employees, women made up a clear minority. And even those few were in the lowest paid positions, mainly in the department where characters were colored. Accusations of sexism were leveled against Disney, both during his lifetime and after his death. One of his colleagues recalled that Walt could not stand cats and women, and if you look at the major animated films of the studio, you will find that the main villains there are women. When Disney was asked why there were practically no women among the animator artists, he replied that they were not creative enough. According to memories of other people who knew Walt well, he, on the contrary, had a great relationship with women and felt more relaxed in their company than in the company of men. Yes, very few women worked in the studio, but this was a common problem of that time. Men were generally hired more and paid more. Don't get me wrong, Walt Disney clearly wasn't a saint, and we will be convinced of this more than once later. But the accusations of sexism against him are clearly exaggerated. In the 1930s, despite the Great Depression, Walt's business thrived. His studio was developing, attracting the best, and setting standards. His long-awaited daughter was born, and a couple of years later, he and his wife adopted a 3-year-old girl. Disney wouldn't have been Disney if he just stopped and continued to earn from what was already profitable. He needed a global idea. The story of Snow White occupied Walt from the very beginning of the 1930s. Even then, many years before the film was released in theaters, he had the entire story in his head. And this story would not fit into 5 minutes, not even an hour. Disney was going to make the first full-length animated film in history. Roy was convinced that such a project would simply bankrupt the studio, and he could be understood. Animation, in comparison with regular live-action cinema, is much more complex, longer, and more expensive to produce. And most importantly, there were no guarantees that the audience was ready to watch animated characters for an hour and a half. The project would be so expensive that the successful and profitable studio had to arrange a large loan with the bank. Of course, Roy would handle these matters. Walt was only interested in what would end up on the screen. The main problem was not even that 80 minutes equals 5,000 seconds, and for this, more than 100,000 drawings would have to be produced. Not that it would require hundreds of people and many years, but that the story itself had to be fundamentally different from short animation. It is impossible to hold the audience's attention for an hour and a half with just jokes. It must be a complex story and complex emotions, the kind that the audience has never experienced before while watching animation. To achieve this, everything on screen must look as realistic as possible. The characters' movements, their appearance, and the expression of emotions. The studio artists are relearning to draw as close to reality as possible. Real animals, a dancing ballerina, dwarfs, and everyone who resembles the characters of the future film, are brought into the studio so that the animators can learn from real examples. The story of Snow White takes a year, 2, 3, and there's no end in sight to production. Rumors are confidently spreading that this will eventually kill the studio. They continue borrowing money from the bank, and the budget surpasses a record $1.5 million. And finally, there's no guarantee that the audience will show up. In the year 1937, 6 years after development began, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs hit the screens. During the premiere, Walt tightly holds his wife's hand for an hour and a half, listening closely to the audience's reaction. During the scene of the main character's death, the audience begins to sob, and there are adults in the hall. At that moment, Disney realizes that everything has succeeded. The audience fully empathizes with the drawn character. Snow White stays in theaters for a record 5 weeks and collects the highest gross box office in cinema history at the time. Walt Disney creates a new direction in art, once again changes the history of animation, becomes one of the major stars of the film industry, and finally, a legend. Thanks to the financial success of Snow White, the Disney brothers decide to move their parents to California and buy a house for them. Walt, despite being busy, always tries to pay attention to his daughters, read to them before bed, spend time on weekends, and of course play a lot. He tries to create for them the childhood he himself did not have, but at the same time, let's not idealize Walt. Throughout his life, he tried to build the image of a simple American from the heartland. But already in the 1930s, and especially after the success of Snow White, the public Walt and the real Disney will diverge more and more, and very soon this will manifest. The studio's triumphant project simultaneously becomes a problem, considering Disney's character. To jump even higher, when you have already created a global phenomenon, is difficult. The idea for a new challenge is presented to Walt by the American Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. Despite the incredible recognition for Snow White, it misses out on the Oscar. Yes, Disney is given a consolatory honorary statuette outside of the categories. Thus, the Academy makes it clear that animation is still somewhat not an art, and Walt accepts the challenge. He plans to produce a full-length project every 6 months. Let me remind you that Snow White alone took years. The next project in line is Fantasia. If you have never heard of this film, I am not surprised. However, by the late 1930s, Disney is confident that this project will be his magnum opus, leaving no doubt that animation is true art. Describing the plot of Fantasia is no simple task. It's not as if there is a conventional narrative. It is a 2-part, quite abstract animated performance set to classical music. The film consists of several segments, each featuring music from renowned composers, Tchaikovsky, Beethoven, and others. Before each segment, a live conductor appears on screen to explain what will be heard next, followed by very beautiful, colorful, yet somewhat incomprehensible actions. Stars, flowers, fairies, dinosaurs, and even dancing mushrooms. According to Disney's vision, this is exactly how it should be, for animation is true eternal art. Simultaneously, the studio is also working on 2 other full-length projects, Pinocchio and Dumbo. In this case, the plot is more comprehensible, but what unites all 3 projects is their complexity, costliness, and innovation. The artists continue to push the boundaries of what is possible for animation. Just look at the underwater scenes in the animated film Pinocchio. It creates the complete illusion that the protagonist is swimming at depth. And yet, these are merely hand-drawn images moving at a speed of 24 frames per second. Even though producing complex animated feature films multiple times a year is already a formidable task, it is precisely during this period that Disney decides to undertake a relocation. In the year 1940, the studio acquires a new home. It's no longer an office, not just a building, but an entire mini-city. Disney joked that it had everything needed except housing for the employees, which was unfortunate because, if that were the case, they might never have had to leave. The new studio includes, besides comfortable working spaces, restaurants, cafes, sports halls, recreational areas, and much more. It sounds like an office dream of our time. Only, let me remind you, this is the mid-past century. During this genuinely insane period in Walt's life, a tragedy occurs. In the new home that he and his brother purchased for their parents, a malfunction in the heating system is discovered. As a result, there is a significant carbon monoxide leak. Disney's parents suffer severe poisoning. The father survives, but the mother cannot be saved. Walt quickly attends the funeral and once again immerses himself in work. He never speaks of his mother's death throughout his life, at least not publicly. This dark streak in Walt's life doesn't end here. In the 1940s, Fantasia, Pinocchio, and Dumbo are released in theaters. Critics give positive reviews to the films, and audiences also attend the theaters quite well, even for the strange fantasy. However, the films' budgets are so large that they do not recoup their costs. Added to this are the exorbitant expenses on the construction of the new studio, which Walt began, without consulting his brother. Disney blames everything on the war in Europe and the fact that the animated films were not released in many countries where they were planned. Yes, that was one of the reasons, but the main issue rather lies in the fact that this time Walt's ideas were too ambitious. He would later admit that, for example, Fantasia was an overly sophisticated project. Walt was never a great aesthete or intellectual. Besides his school education, Disney completed only a couple of short courses related to drawing. To be fair, all three films took a rightful place in the history of animation and inspired several generations of creators. However, alas, this does not help the studio at the beginning of the 40s. They are on the brink of bankruptcy. The only chance to save the situation is to go public. For Walt, this is a step born out of desperation because making the company public and starting to sell shares means losing independence. At the same time, the studio's problems begin not only from the outside, but from within as well. The new offices are convenient, clean and spacious, but all of this starts to resemble a laboratory where each worker performs a specific function. The studio has nearly 1,000 employees. The small creative family that the studio once was is becoming a soulless corporation. Disney himself is now equipped with his own office, complete with a bedroom and bathroom, as well as a large staff of secretaries and assistants. Fragmentation is felt on other levels too. There are departments for the chief artists, and these people are respected and receive good salaries. However, employees in lower positions earn such modest income that they cannot always afford to dine in the cafeteria on the studio grounds. Such tendencies are occurring not only in Disney's company, but throughout Hollywood. Cinema is becoming a big profitable business, yet the main dividends are obtained by studio heads, star actors, and directors. The response to this problem is the emergence of trade unions or guilds. In feature films, they appear a little earlier. The Animators Guild is formed at the beginning of the 40s. It includes workers from all studios in the country except Disney's, which is almost half of all industry workers. Walt is not very worried about the whole situation with the unions for one simple reason. He is confident that his subordinates are more than satisfied. He offers them the opportunity to create and pays a good, or at least decent salary. What more could a Disney employee want? Especially when the primary reason for joining the company is to work for the greatness of animation's idea. In addition, Walt genuinely believes he is still one of the guys. Just like the rest, he did not even notice when he turned into a typical industrial boss. Finally, realizing the threat that his artists might join a union, Disney decides to meet with the employees. What could have been a reconciliatory speech by an understanding leader turns into a threat. The general message could be summed up with one phrase: here, everyone gets what they deserve and don't even think about joining a union. The first major studio animator to oppose Walt is Art Babbitt, one of the chief artists not only of the company but in the industry. It is he who created Goofy. Art Babbitt joins a union for which Disney immediately fires him. Following this, several hundred employees go on strike. They begin picketing right at the studio's entrance, forcing Walt to enter through a different gate. One day, Babbitt, spotting him, grabs a megaphone and starts shouting slogans at Walt. Walt jumps out of his car, a scuffle ensues, and eventually Babbitt and Disney are separated by other protesters. None of this changes Walt's mood, quite the opposite. He cannot believe that his employees might simply be unhappy with their working conditions. One of Disney's main talents has always been an interesting story. A great story requires a powerful villain. Walt found one in real life. He considered the true cause of all the strikes to be a communist conspiracy. Disney was accused of many things throughout his life: sexism, anti-Semitism, racism. But in reality, the only people he truly disliked were communists, and we will return to this later. At that moment, Walt is so bewildered and angry that he decides to take a business trip to South America. According to the US government, Disney is an excellent candidate to establish cultural contact with an important region. There, Walt is welcomed like a superstar. He is a true legend. People adore his cartoons and characters. Here he's seen as the hero of animation, not a heartless industrial magnate bleeding his unfortunate workers. Disney doesn't interrupt his trip, not even to attend his own father's funeral. Roy, unlike his brother, is more pragmatic. He understands that unions are a new reality that needs to be recognized. He manages to resolve the conflict even before Walt returns. The workers receive what they demanded. Although the parties reach an agreement, after the trip Disney realizes that something has changed at the studio. There's no longer any creative family. He cannot trust anyone. He asks his secretary to set aside a separate pile of documents for those who participated in the strike. Sooner or later, these people will stop working at the company. This is a glaring example of Walt's dark side. When someone disagreed with him or resisted, Disney became ruthless and somewhat underhanded. Against the backdrop of these events, in the year 1942, Bambi hits the screens, another recognized masterpiece from the studio. However, the same situation occurs as with the previous 3 feature-length projects. It was too expensive to produce and thus failed to recoup its costs. It is hard to believe, but precisely then, in the early 40s, Disney ceases to be essentially an animation studio. That is, they will of course continue to produce cartoons, including feature-length films, but they will not be the main source of Disney's company revenue. On one hand, Walt blamed the war in Europe for his financial failures. On the other hand, the war somewhat saved the studio from bankruptcy. At this time, the company survives solely on government contracts. They produce educational and propaganda cartoons. Thanks to cooperation with the government, Disney realizes that they can significantly save on production costs. To achieve this, they simply need to greatly simplify their approach. Labor efforts drastically decrease, cartoons are made faster, and profits grow. The first notable studio project after the war becomes Song of the South, a musical film executed in a technique that combines animation and live-action cinema. At that time, such an approach was already much simpler than full-fledged animation. And although many critics note the technical merits of the film, this is not what becomes the main topic of discussion. Today, you will find it difficult to legally watch this film. The Disney studio decided to sweep Song of the South under the rug, all due to the film's racist undertones. The fact is, the depiction of the black characters, including the main one, turned out to be extremely controversial. Slaves singing songs, plantations, all portrayed in such a nostalgic light. The film is released right after the war, when a new wave of segregation is beginning in the United States. Naturally, many African Americans were deeply outraged by the picture. Disney, in turn, does not quite understand the critics. He sincerely thought he was creating a true American story, at least as he understood it. Thus, Walt once again suspects communists. Allegedly, they are behind the negative reviews of the film. Yet, considering the studio still tries not to publicize Song of the South, it is evident that the problem wasn't with the communists. After the war, an active fight against the Red Threat begins in the USA and Hollywood, among others. Bosses of large companies agree that they must protect American ideals from communists. The famous hearings begin, aiming to identify the names of participants in the communist movement among Hollywood figures. He accuses many people who 6 years earlier were the main faces in union pickets. Yet Disney provides no evidence of their involvement with the Communist Party. They simply once opposed him, and revenge for Walt knows no statute of limitations. As a result of the hearings, the famous Hollywood blacklist will be created, which would ruin the careers of many filmmakers of that time. Those whom Disney denounced won't end up there. But nonetheless, this episode once again vividly showcases Walt's dark side. Disney Studio continues the search for new formats that, unlike full-length animation, will bring in good money but be cheaper to produce. They find several solutions. The first, full-length live-action films. One of the big successes of that time becomes Treasure Island, an adventure film that fully fits the format of Disney's family-friendly entertainment. The second solution Disney found is quite unexpected. You have certainly all seen documentaries about animals, these colourful films about how monkeys live in the jungles, bears in the North Pole, and so on. Well, this particular type of documentary filmmaking was actually invented by Disney. In the late 40s, he once again successfully utilized his main talent, the art of storytelling. He came up with the idea that filming nature could not merely be the capturing of reality, but rather a narrative, where the audience not only watched a bunch of penguins walking through the snow, but also followed a storyline. For example, the main characters might be a little penguin chick and its mother, and the antagonist could be some predator or natural disaster that hinders the protagonists from reaching their destination and threatens their lives. Thus, the first experience in this format was a Disney studio documentary about fur seals in Alaska. Apart from setting a standard for the genre, this approach also proved to be quite profitable for the studio. Production was inexpensive and animals wouldn't go on strike. Nonetheless, despite all the successes of live-action and documentary films, full-length animation still haunted Disney. In 1950, Cinderella hit the screens. I'm sure many of you have seen it. And it's not surprising, as the film truly became a classic. Critics praised it upon release, and the substantial box office earnings reflected the public's love. It might seem Walt Disney should have been happy. However, he couldn't help but notice that Cinderella was technically simpler in many ways than the studio's previous works. In private conversations, Disney admitted that perhaps he would never again be able to create something better than Snow White. Disney was nearing 50, experiencing an obvious midlife crisis. What might a man of his status and wealth do in such a case? Buy a yacht? Have a mistress? Travel to Europe for a year? What does Walt do? He starts building toy models of railroads, but not merely spending 20 minutes a day on a kit after work. He builds massive models all day long. It all began a couple of years earlier. Disney visited his childhood town Marceline, and upon returning created a huge model railroad in his backyard and another one at the studio. Possibly it was yet another attempt to reclaim the childhood he never had. But Disney approached this new hobby with utmost seriousness. He even invited renowned guests like Salvador Dali to see his achievements. At the time, no one could have guessed where this new insane pastime would lead. No one knows precisely when the idea of Disneyland formed in Walt's mind, but it likely occurred during his railroad obsession period. In 1952, he sold part of his property, sold the studio rights to his name, and all this to embark on something new. Disney was not merely envisioning an amusement park, he was imagining a parallel world. Parks with carousels, carnivals and performances already existed at the time, but they were often quite dirty, neglected places. In Disney's mind, there emerged an image of a place where parents alongside their children could enjoy their time and enter astonishing worlds. Roy Disney, of course, opposed his brother's new idea, as it could easily cost tens of millions of dollars without any guarantee that the venture would pay off. Moreover, funding had to be sourced from somewhere, and selling real estate alone wouldn't suffice. But Walt already had an idea: television. The era of the 1950s marked the growth of TV. Screens began to appear in every American household, television channels were being created, but the main problem was content. Channels needed something to fill their airtime with. They persuaded Disney to produce series and programs for them and were willing to pay. Walt secured a major contract with one of the channels. He would personally host one of the shows for many years. At that time, Disney certainly believed in television's bright future, but the real goal of the deal was the park. Now he had the resources for it. Later he would joke that the channel executives needed content so badly that they bought an entire park. Let's give due credit to Walt's adventurous spirit. He was already in his 50s, a legend in his own right, yet he took on a venture that could easily bankrupt the studio. This was entirely possible, despite all the contracts signed. Simply put, the park was very expensive. Calling it a park was quite challenging, given the vast area meant to house several different worlds. Thus, the spontaneously conceived name Disneyland, essentially Disney's land, perfectly described this phenomenon. The park's construction proceeded in the best traditions of the studio's ambitious projects. The budget was exceeded by 3 times and amounted to nearly $20 million. At the last moment before the opening, it seemed like the builders wouldn't make it in time, with Disney himself running around and helping paint walls. Nonetheless, in July 1955, Disneyland opened its doors to visitors for the first time. Thanks to active advertising, including Walt's own TV show, there was a complete frenzy. The traffic jam on the approach to Disneyland stretched over 10 kilometers. Half the country watched the opening broadcast on television. Disneyland instantly became popular not only in the United States but also abroad. Many heads of state included it in their itinerary when visiting the USA. Disneyland brought the company millions of dollars annually and almost immediately became a hallmark of American culture. Walt himself seemed as inspired as his visitors. He had an apartment practically on the park's grounds and could occasionally stroll into the park before the start of the working day, still in his robe, make himself a freshly squeezed juice from a vending machine and wander the streets before Disneyland opened. After Disneyland's success, Walt had no intention of stopping. Yet despite his energy and new ideas, he gradually begins to ponder his legacy. In the year 1961, he turns 60 years old. A few years later, the famous Disney studio film, Mary Poppins, is released on screens. It receives several Oscars, becomes a box office hit, and is a bright embodiment of the studio's philosophy. Bright, colourful, musical and kind for children and parents. But despite its popularity, Mary Poppins strongly dissonates with what is happening at that moment in the United States. The assassination of Kennedy, the Vietnam War, the fight against discrimination, this is a very different America. Walt Disney embodied conventional traditional values all his life. He was not politically active, but nevertheless donated money to the Republican Party, known for its conservative agenda, and most importantly embodied these values in what his studio produced. In the mid-60s, Disney and real America begin to increasingly drift apart from each other. At the same time, Walt himself begins to die. He started smoking very early and was known for his loud cough. Studio workers often recalled that they could precisely determine the boss's approach by his cough. In the year 1966, during the filming of a promo for the second Disneyland, he becomes unwell. During an examination, Disney is diagnosed with lung cancer. The doctor's prognosis is a maximum of 2 years. Walt dies a few months later, at the age of 65. The next day, the news of his death appears in all the major newspapers worldwide. Some might say that everything Walt Disney did smacks of some plastic and fast food. And yes, there is some truth in that. Disney himself, towards the end of his life, often wondered whether his films, parks and animation were merely short-lived entertainment that is quickly forgotten. On the other hand, it is unlikely anyone would deny that Disney's animation not only shaped a generation of people worldwide, but also helped answer questions about good, evil, love, hate, and finally, what makes us human. Walt Disney was undoubtedly a complex and contradictory person, but perhaps it was precisely because of this that he understood human nature so well.